According to the internet, this is a legitimate way to hail a cab in New York City, and that is to flap your arms like a bird to signal the driver that you are going to an airport. I have yet to prove the validity of this tip, but riding a cab in New York doesn't have to be complicated. So in this video, we are gonna cover everything you need to know to ride the iconic yellow vehicles that swarm Manhattan, the New York City Taxi. You can call them taxis or you can call them cabs, and everybody will know what you're talking about. There's also a green taxi in New York City, and the difference between a yellow taxi and a green taxi is that a yellow taxi can pick up passengers anywhere in the 5 boroughs of Manhattan, whereas a green taxi cannot pick up in this area of Manhattan. But for all intents and purposes, we are going to only talk about the yellow cab. Yes, I know it's the age of share rides like Lyft and Uber, and there are some New Yorkers that can't remember the last time they took a taxi. But there are instances where it's far more convenient and cost-effective to take a taxi over a Lyft or Uber, and vice versa. Usually, if you're going short distances within Manhattan, I recommend taking a taxi. I'm going to make another video that addresses that question: when is it better to take a taxi over a Lyft or Uber, and vice versa. So subscribe and stay tuned for that video. But in this video, we are going to talk about how to get a taxi in New York City, the easiest and most effective way to tell your driver where you are going, and finally, the cost and methods of payment. There are 3 ways to get a taxi in NYC. The first way is the good old-fashioned raise your hand on the side of the street and hail a cab way. Nothing fancy, just the simple act to make yourself visible. If you are a tourist staying in Manhattan and you don't want to hail a cab for yourself, especially when it's raining, you can always ask the doorman of your hotel to do that for you. But if you do ask for this service, the doorman is going to expect the tip. And in New York, $2 to $3 is reasonable. Unless they help you out with your baggage, and then in that case, you might want to add a little more. To know that a taxi is on duty and available to pick up passengers, the center light that has their number is lit up. If no lights are lit up, then the taxi is occupied. Also, make sure you hail a cab that's going in the direction that you want to go to, because if you hail a cab going the opposite direction, it's a bit of a pain to try to turn around, whether it's a U-turn or going into some weird side alley, and it's just gonna add to your meter fare. And if you want to take a cab from one of the airports, don't hail one. This is frowned upon. There's actually a line for cabs when you exit the airport. And while we're at it, if you're exiting the airport and someone comes up to you asking for a taxi ride and starts leading you somewhere, know that this is not kosher. There's an official line. The taxis line up here, there's a dispatcher, and this is the official way to get a cab at the airport. The second way to order a cab is to use the Korb app. Yes, taxis have caught up to the technology that Uber and Lyft are using. They're only a decade late, but it's finally here. The app opens to a screen like this. Pair and pay is when you are already in a cab and want to pay that specific cab that you are riding. But if you don't have a cab near you and you want to order one, you can choose to get one ASAP or schedule one. But both of these options have fees. And the third way is to call a dispatcher. This is basically picking up the phone and calling a cab company and giving them your address and a time that you want a cab. Before the age of Uber and Lyft, if you needed to be at the airport at the butt crack of dawn, you would call the dispatcher and ask that a taxi would be at your address at, say, 3 in the morning. And you would pray to the 7 or even the northern gods for good measure that that taxi is gonna show up at your door on time and doesn't get lost. Calling a dispatcher to order a cab is old school, but it still exists. Cab drivers in New York know the city grid like the back of their hand. Having said that though, spouting out a street address or a name of the establishment that you want to go to is not the most efficient way to letting the cab driver know where you're going, unless it's a very popular establishment like the Empire State Building. No matter how popular a restaurant is on Instagram, there's a good chance your driver will not know where that is. And even if you give them the street address to that restaurant, they might still need to look that up on a GPS. The most effective way to tell your driver where you are going is by giving them the cross street. And what do I mean by that? If you haven't seen my video on Manhattan's grid layout, which is linked in the description below, the best way to summarize it is that Manhattan has avenues that run north and south and streets that run east and west. Just give the cab driver the intersection nearest your destination. Convention is that you say the street name first and then the avenue, like 34th and 7th. But it's not the end of the world if you switch them up as long as you mention which is the avenue and which is the street. So to be on the safe side, make sure you mention the words street and avenue. In case it's rush hour and cabs are few and far in between, when you finally hail a cab, make sure you get in the cab first and then tell them where you are headed. Because legally, they have to take you where you want to go. But if it happens that a cab drives up, rolls down their window and asks you where they're going and they don't want to go that way, they can simply just drive off. In general, as I mentioned earlier, if you are staying within Manhattan and traveling short distances, I recommend taking a taxi over an Uber or Lyft. This could potentially cost less, if not the same, and it's far more convenient because the taxi is just already there, whereas an Uber or Lyft, you have to somehow sync up with the driver. If you're coming from LaGuardia or JFK, you might potentially save money by using a cab too. And this is something I will discuss in my later video of when is it better to take a taxi versus an Uber or Lyft and vice versa. So subscribe and stay tuned for that video. As for the price of a cab, it's best to explain with the receipt of my recent taxi ride. The actual fare is based on the meter. The meter starts at $2.50 once you get in the cab. Then it's an additional 50 cents per 1/5 of a mile or 50 cents for every minute that the cab is in idle or in slow traffic. Slow traffic is movement under 12 miles per hour. Fees and surcharges are added to the fare. It's not just taxi cabs. Uber and Lyft also have their own set of fees and surcharges as well. In the United States, and New York City in particular, there is a huge tipping culture. It's expected that you tip your cab driver. 15% is the norm if the service is satisfactory, 20% if exceptional, and at the minimum, 10% is expected. Although tipping is customary and expected, it's not obligated. So if you just had the cab ride from hell, no judgment if you don't tip. So how do you pay for a cab? There are 3 ways. You can pay with the old-fashioned cold hard cash. If you do, make sure your largest bill is a $20 because cabs might not have change for a $50 or $100 bill. The second way is to pay with a credit or debit card. There's no minimum charge or transaction fee when you use a credit card or debit card. And lastly, you can use the Korb app. When you hail a cab and you get in, you can pair that cab with the Korb app. To do this, you use the pay and pair feature. You simply input the code that is in the back seat of the taxi. If the taxi doesn't have this code, then you can't use the Korb app, so you might have to pay with a credit card or with cash. Unlike the rest of the United States, New York is not an ideal place to be driving around with a vehicle, but it does offer a myriad of transportation options. I have a playlist on my channel that covers the wide variety of transportation in New York City, from riding a bike to scooter to ferry, and the most popular, the subway. So I encourage you to check out those videos if you haven't already, and subscribe to my channel for future videos on transportation and the city itself. With that, thank you so much for watching and happy New Yorking.